Welcome to St. John. Nothing Happened Here, with your hosts Greg Marquis and Mark Allen Green, a show all about a little city on the east coast of Canada where nothing ever happened. Except for this.
Good day to you, sir.
Good day to you as well.
1784 has proven to be the most marvelous indeed.
Yes, quite. Look upon all we've accomplished in just over a year.
Yes, it has turned into quite the place, my good man. We have certainly cut a splendid diamond from its rough.
I should say so. Of course, we loyal British subjects can conquer anything.
Except our thirst for fine brandy.
Your wit, dear sir, is as sharp as the jagged rocks on these newly hewn roads.
Oh, you are too kind, sir. But surely Parr Town shall become the pride of the empire.
Did you not hear? Plans are underway to change the name to St. John.
How ghastly of a choice, not the least bit British.
French, I believe.
I feel faint.
Wait, I have a simply smashing idea. Let's have some fun and name all the streets after the finest Britons the Empire has ever known.
Oh, yes, a jolly good idea indeed. You go first.
No, my dear sir, after you.
Well, if you insist. I shall call this one Germain, after George Germain, 1st Viscount Sackville.
Splendid choice. And this one shall be called Pitt after Sir William Pitt.
Well played, my good man. This street calls to me like Sheffield.
George Baker Hollywood, 1st Earl of Sheffield.
Is there any other Sheffield?
Not in my books, dear sir.
Let's call this one Winslow.
This one simply must be called Guildford.
Carlton.
Ludlow.
St. Patrick Street.
St. Patrick Street? Have you gone mad?
Just pulling your leg, old chap.
Oh, you a rascal to the core.
Yes, but a loyal British subject rascal through and through.
Indubitably. Here's to the British Empire. May the mighty lion roar forever across the 7 seas to the 4 corners of the earth.
Here. Question?
Yes, old chap.
Might it be prudent to inquire into the lives of the men we just immortalized into these streets? You know, see if there's any skeletons in their closets, so to say?
They're all fine British subjects and servants of His Majesty.
Then I consider the inquiry complete. To king and country.
To king and country, and may all future historical analysis be superficial and favor the crown.
Here. Welcome to the podcast, everyone. And Greg, the first thing we have to do is we have to promise our listeners never to attempt British accents again.
That's right, Mark.
But I'll have to say yours was better than mine. You really were able to channel your inner Dennis Nib.
Or Christopher Plummer, whatever works.
There we go. And with the Dennis Nib reference, we're going to determine our demographics. Some people out there going, Dennis who? And then other people are starting to chant Ringo.
Yeah. Legendary principal at St. John High. Huge supporter of history in St. John, and of course he was on the St. John Common Council for a number of years.
Let's talk about the British accent. So we kind of had a bit of fun with these St. Johners acting very British, but they weren't British to begin with.
No, the Loyalists were Americans, and people are really not sure what sort of accents Americans had in the 1780s, right? Because there were no recordings of it, obviously.
So it could have been a little bit of British, it could have been a little bit of American, it could have been something different than the American accents that we hear today. Yep. I think you had mentioned this before, that probably the elite to put on those airs kept to a very aristocratic British accent.
Yeah, definitely prior to the Revolution. And there were regional accents, north, south, right? And then I think some of the things I've read about language and accents in the States is after the Revolution, it became less fashionable to have upper class British accents for obvious reasons, right?
So, okay. So it might have been intentionally.
It's kind of one of those unknowns. It is an interesting thing. How do you go back and try to understand that? But yeah.
Interesting. Now, what on the surface does not seem interesting is talking about street names. Our whole premise of this show, in case anyone hasn't got it by now, is St. John, nothing happened here. We're trying to disprove that. Lots happened to St. John. Now it seems like we're trying to go, okay, nothing happened here because we're 4 episodes in and we're talking about the names of streets. But why are street names really interesting to show something did happen in St. John?
It's one of those subjects that when you start to think about it, it is sort of interesting because the streets reflect the community, or at least what the people in charge of naming things such as streets and buildings and parks and squares think's important at a certain time in history. And of course, these names sometimes change over time. So in a sense, it's a snapshot of what the Loyalist leaders were thinking at the time about their community, about their role in the British Empire, etc.
I like that you said, who was important, but people who were excluded, shows who were not important.
Yeah, as we'll talk about in today's pod, a lot of people in the community were not reflected in the street names.
Let's go into our time machine, Greg, and we're going back to 1784 to when the initial city plan was laid out, and this would have been for Parr Town, which later became St. John, but the uptown area, the peninsula. And it was laid out by Paul Bedell. No street name after Paul Bedell, maybe, except I did find Bedell Street in North St. John. Would that be named after the original surveyor?
That'd be one for someone to let us know if they know anything about that.
You think he would deserve a street named after him? He put together the original plan, but the original plan was that typical grid pattern with the public squares laid out, and then so we had the King Square and Queen Square, and that's I have to use this opportunity to talk about that. The apostrophe S. The appearing and disappearing apostrophe S. I've seen that in the historic records that sometimes it is King Square and Queen Square. Sometimes it's King's Square and Queen Square. I've seen the sign now on King Square, and it has apostrophe S. Yeah. And Queen Square, everyone seems to be adamant that no, it is no apostrophe S. Harold Wright and David Goss in their book, they were saying, no, apostrophe S on the uptown side, the peninsula side. On the west side, take away the apostrophe S.
Oh, okay.
Any idea? Can you settle the argument? As a historian, please.
I grew up in St. John, lived in the area, and I don't know. It's like St. John versus STS, St. John River. So but it's one of those little quirks in the city, right? Yeah.
Fair enough. Yeah. So I'm looking at this now. It's on my screen, and it looks beautiful. It's like a perfect grid pattern, that kind of British style, but that was not the way it actually was. These streets were not passable.
Well, there were trees, there were rocks, there were swamp. It was an idealized thing. So it took a few years or decades for the actual street pattern to be created on the ground because of Mother Nature getting in the way, right? So some streets were not connected. Some streets that run like now from Courtney Bay to St. John Harbor were not connected all the way through. And also some of the names would change over time, as we'll see, and more streets were added. I think we've mentioned before that what is now Prince William Street, I think it was right along the water. The waves might be lapping right up on high tide against Prince William Street, right? So things did change over time. And the names, from what we can tell, were chosen by local officials, not by the British government or anything like that. And the early pattern is that they're going for well-known people, well-known loyalists, members of the British royalty, maybe some British generals, officials in the empire, because this city is created as a result of the American Revolution.
To expand upon the topography, have you heard about the honeypots?
Were these swampy areas, or was it sewage?
Yeah, kind of swampy, a little bit of human waste and other waste and kind of stuff. So if you look at the original plan, the market slip area did not exist.
No.
So it was just supposedly just mud and running off from King Street coming down and all this kind of stuff. And what happened, and this comes from the St. John Chronicle article written in 1825 about these honeypots, is that they had a 2-foot, it sounded like wooden sidewalk to kind of take you over these mud flats, other flats, if you know what I mean. So you had to stay on this thing, but supposedly the ground on either side looked solid, to the unknowing person.
Mhm.
So people would step off of this 2-foot wide sidewalk all the time, and you would sink. You would
Okay.
go right under in this muck. And they
Yeah.
actually had a pole and rope company, is what this article called it, that was ready to go at a moment's notice to drag people out of the muck to save
Yeah.
their lives. But this
Yeah.
is how bad that area was. So
Yeah.
no matter what you think of any renovations to that area, we don't have honeypots anymore.
No.
And we can be thankful about that.
Yes. Progress, Mark.
Progress. But some of
Yeah.
the changes you talked about, streets have changed in the uptown area since the 1784 town plan.
Yeah.
And they obviously pretty quick
Yeah.
after Paul Bedell put in the plan. And just some of the street names have changed. King Street East, original name, Great George Street.
Okay.
So it's going to king kind of thing, but just
Yeah.
going the more generic. Princess Street, the west side of it would have been Tyne Street. The east side of it would have been St. George. Okay, this might be a stupid question, but St. George Street, did they canonize a Protestant king? Or is that named after...
That's probably St. George and the Dragon, right?
Okay.
Way back, an important figure in British history, English history, I'm guessing. But it's Great George Street, not St. George, right?
But
George.
St. George was the east side of Princess Street. So Great George Street, I get, but St. George.
Yeah. St.
So
George, it'd be like St. David, these saints from, although I guess they were Catholic saints, but it's still an important symbol for Britain throughout time, kind of like John Bull. St. George.
It's just like, a very Protestant-based population calling anything saint
Yes.
seemed a little odd to me. But
yeah, but I think St. George gets a pass because fighting that dragon. Although I think he fought it actually in someplace like Armenia, but for some reason the English picked up the legend.
In my books, you fight a dragon, you get a street named after you.
That's right.
So then you have Charlotte Street. Was Studholme Street, so that would have been named after Major Guilford Studholme, who set up Fort Howe.
That's right, and became in part of the early New Brunswick government.
And then Broad Street, approximately Broad Street, was Fanning Street.
Yeah, I think that he was a loyalist who later became Lieutenant Governor of Prince Edward Island, maybe. Anyway, he's a loyalist.
And then lost the street named after him unceremoniously, ceremoniously. We don't know. We don't know what happened with that. Yeah. So then we have those street names, and of course, like there's more to St. John than Uptown St. John, and we have to be looking across the harbor. And what was across the harbor called?
Carleton. It was named after Thomas Carleton, first Lieutenant Governor of New Brunswick. And you get that confusing thing where, although it's part of the same city, there's streets with the same names. On the west side, it must have been very confusing before there were postal codes when people sent letters. But there's squares and streets on the west side of the harbor that have the same names as on the east side of the harbor.
And it's not confusing now.
Yeah. Well, I think it still is.
Still think it's confusing. Yes. Yeah. As you were saying, so we have Carleton on the other side, and not to be confused with his brother Guy Carleton from the American Revolution, different Carleton. But then you have some street names, of course, named after Loyalists. We have Sewell Street. So Sewell was who was Sewell again?
He was a Massachusetts Loyalist, Jonathan
Sewell, yes.
I don't think he stayed long in the community. I think he later moved to Lower Canada or Quebec, where he became a judge.
Long enough to get a name or street named after him. So, and then we have Ludlow. So that was named after the first mayor of St. John, Gabriel Ludlow.
Yeah, and we'll probably hear about him more than once. Former member of Delancey's Brigade.
Edward Winslow got Winslow Street named after him. He was an elitist and of the Plymouth Rock Winslows.
Yes. I'm sure he always told people that too.
Oh, I'm sure. If they had T-shirts back then, he would have got a T-shirt. I'm one of the Plymouth Rock Winslows.
Because I've never met a person who's descended from the Plymouth Rock settlers who doesn't tell you that they're descended from the Plymouth Rock.
So that's what they lead off with. In a conversation.
And again, he later. He made the cardinal sin of moving to Fredericton later because it became part of the government, right? The first government of New Brunswick.
Kept the street name, though. So then we move on in time. So we're away from the origins, and we're getting into, when Great Britain was at war with revolutionary France and the Napoleonic Wars that followed, 1793 to 1815. Then you got a sort of a flavor coming from the Napoleonic Wars. So you had the Battle of Waterloo. So we got a street named after that. We have Admiral Nelson and Lord Wellington. We got streets named after that. Then take us to post 1815.
Well, after 1815, although the British aren't involved in any major wars in Europe, there's two things happening. The British Empire is expanding, so there are lots of little wars, like in India and places like that, as new colonies are being carved out. And then there's British immigrants who began to show up. The city's also expanding, right? So some new streets have to be laid out within the city limits. And you start to get the Loyalists being the second and third generation of Loyalists being replaced by intermarrying with English, Scottish, and especially Irish immigrants. And so so St. John becomes more of a British city, less of an American city in terms of the people. And a lot of those immigrants are coming from Ireland. But as we've already mentioned in one or more podcasts, a lot of those Irish immigrants are divided between Protestants and Catholics.
Okay, so the flavor of the city starts changing. The demographic starts changing from that American loyalist foundings to getting a little bit more Irish and getting a little bit less Protestant and more Catholic. And that's a great segue into, hey, St. John, the most Irish city in Canada, except its street names.
That's right. Where are the Irish street names?
Give me three.
I don't know if I can give you three now, but Leinster running north-south through the south end. No, that, again, I'm not sure it was named after a province of Ireland, because remember, Ireland had like the 4 provinces traditionally. Or there's possibly named after the Duke of Leinster, who was an Anglo-Irish aristocrat who was posted here briefly with the British Army, who deserves his own podcast, really. But it's more like a story in Irish history. It's a very romantic story. St. Patrick Street, not to be confused with the current St. Patrick Street, which used to be known as Dock Street, running down to the foot of King, but in the so-called east end of St. John, down between Waterloo and Courtney Bay, there used to be St. Patrick Street and Erin Street, right? But used to be is the operative term here, Mark, is what happened to those streets.
I think urban renewal did away with those.
That's right. Yeah, they kind of removed one and renamed another. So I guess when they were doing urban renewal in the late 50s, early 60s, people weren't really worried much about the Irish heritage of St. John. In terms of Ireland, I mean, because it's, again, the whole British Empire thing, a lot of streets in both the St. John and in the North End, which for many decades was the town of Portland, which amalgamated with St. John in 1889. Many of the streets were named after British military and political figures who took part in the English control of Ireland or benefited from it by owning large estates and collecting rents from tenant farmers. And for they're either helping to control Ireland or benefiting from the English control of Ireland, which only ended in, at least for most of Ireland, 1922.
And examples of those would be Sir John Harvey, so Harvey Street, and Lord Dufferin.
Yeah, Lord Dufferin, who Governor General of Canada famously in the 1970s, but he was also a very conservative Irish landowner who didn't want to support any of the types of land reforms that were being promoted at the time by, I think it was Prime Minister Gladstone in England.
Okay, so that's the Irish. Thanks for coming to St. John, and you get 3 streets or 4 streets named after you.
We're going to take them away.
And we're going to take them away later on. How about the Scots?
I feel bad for the Scots because they were here early on. I mean, the St. Andrews Society was founded in 1798. I think
they got one street.
Yeah, they got one street and they lost it.
They lost it.
Well, I could be wrong on this, but St. Andrews Street, right? But after the War of 1812, for some reason, they changed the name to Great Britain Street. And then people just stopped saying the word great and it became Britain Street. Britain Street. Yeah.
Okay, so sorry, Scottish. You kind of lumped in with the Irish, except a little bit less recognition. How about women?
Well, Mark, as you might expect, it's the times, right? So women weren't politicians, or they were kind of held back in many, many levels: politics, economics, society. So, as you might expect, the only names linked to women are royals, royal women like princesses and things like that. So, Charlotte Street and Queen Street in St. John, both named after the wife of George III. And then do you want to talk about Mecklenburg?
Mecklenburg, I always found that to be such an odd name because it's so German.
Yeah.
And it was like, why do we have such a German name in Uptown St. John? But it's because Queen Charlotte's German origins.
Yes. Yeah. And that's
so it was a shout out to Queen Charlotte. They go, well, we can't name we named Charlotte Street. We got Queen Street, but we really want to show our love for Queen Charlotte. So let's come up with some other way to recognize her.
So, and then Princess Street, two connected streets were later renamed Princess, which is a well-known street in the South End now, going right down to the harbor. O'Leary's and other landmarks are found on Princess Street, and in honor of a daughter of King George III and Queen Charlotte.
And Tyne Street and St. George Street got the boot to give that homage to the princess.
And of course, we need a Victoria Street because how could you have a city in Canada in the 19th century without having at least one street named after Queen Victoria?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that's over in Portland, which later became part of St. John.
And then we have to turn to the Indigenous connection. So there should be a lot of Indigenous street names.
Well, again, reflecting the period of time, it's surprising for our modern perspective. But I mean, I guess I don't think it was on their agenda back in the day. It's interesting because in New Brunswick itself, as you know, Mark, there are a lot of place names and villages and rivers and lakes named after Indigenous names or influenced by them. Right, but it's rare in St. John. Indigenous place names seem to have been ignored or forgotten, more so than in other parts of the province in terms of these landmarks. Anyway,
so we have some examples though. Manawaganish Road.
Yeah, that seems to have been taken from the Wolastoqey or Maliseet term for which is the area, not the road, because there was no road prior to the settlers, the white settlers coming. So Anasquis, I'm not sure I pronounced that correctly, but Anasquis, and that was their term, the Wolastoqey term for the St. John area. And I think the French picked it up, then the British picked it up from the French, and somehow it morphed into Manawaganish. And we see this happening in other parts of Canada where settlers come in and they think they're hearing something, they write it down, and it kind of gets morphed into something else. And the large island off St. Celeste Beach has the same name. What's interesting, if you look at some of these atlases from the 1800s, Manawaganish is sometimes called Mahogany Road or Mahogany Island, right? So again, there's a confusion.
Okay, and speaking of the French, let's see what the French connection. Now, mind you, we got a very British town. Brits were at war with France for a good, a few centuries at least. A long time. So probably not a lot of names with a French connection.
Although, Mark, the river, the harbor, and the new loyalist city, St. John, right? It was Champlain de Mont who came up with St. Jean, right? Because when they sailed in 1604, it was the Feast of St. John. So so that was adapted, but anglicized. But you're right. Not very French, not a lot of French people living in the city. So it was really only in the 20th century, I think, where we started as suburbs were being built, in outlying areas, east and west, even early 1900s, Champlain Street and de Mont Street on the west side, which were kind of outlying areas at the time for residential buildings. And then, in Simon's Parish, which amalgamated with St. John in 1867, there's Champlain Drive, right? So again, these were more modern 20th century.
My old stomping grounds.
You're a Champlain Heights guy, right?
On the east side of St. John.
Yeah.
But it's funny that you should say that. Like, St. John is a French name, and it's funny that they wouldn't go, we just took over this.
Yeah.
We're going to not just keep the St. John River, keep the St. John Harbor, but we're going to actually name the city after St. John, that they wouldn't try to anglicize that.
I guess maybe they figured the river itself was such an established landmark and area for transportation and so they just figured, well, we'd have to change so many maps.
So it's a marketing thing. Really. Ward Chipman was going, I would like to change this, but the marketing nightmare to try to rebrand.
Why can't we call it Chipmanville?
Hey,
they have one.
That was probably his lead. he was pitching that. And they go, okay, fine, St. John. We'll keep St. John.
Yeah.
Okay, so how about Black people?
Well, again, as we'll hear about in a future episode or more, maybe when we look at the issue of Black Loyalists or the Black history of New Brunswick, which is in St. John, which is a very important part of our community. There were Black people in the Loyalist migrations. There were free Blacks and enslaved people. But they've been really until recently barely recognized in local history or commemoration or being honored with street names. It's kind of shocking in a way that it's only in 2023 that a street was named after a well-known Black figure in St. John's Black Pass, Dr. Abraham Walker. So on the campus of UNB St. John, where I work, they named a short thoroughfare after him in 2023. He was the first Canadian-born Black lawyer, and he practiced in St. John. He died in 1909.
Yeah, so it's interesting that, and interesting in a bad way, of why there's not more. And like the name Cornelius Sparrow comes to mind as someone who is very deserving of having a street named after him. And we'll definitely have to do a podcast in the future about Cornelius Sparrow.
Entrepreneur, big important entrepreneur. Yeah.
Yes, and groundbreaking in the time. So it's a interesting. Well, again, I use the term interesting too much, and I've got to stop using it. It's not interesting. It's an oversight. Yeah. I think
it reflects a lot about the power structures, who was in and who was excluded, in the society at the time.
So let's take a trip around St. John and look at some street names. And the first thing we have to know about street names is anytime you name a street after a person, you're taking a risk.
Yes.
Okay. You're taking a risk that if they're still living, they might do something really bad and go, woo, we made a mistake naming this street after this person. The other risk is, 100 years later, some historians start digging around and go, oh, you did something really, really bad, and you have the street named after them. So that's always risky. You can't go really wrong if you call it Tulip Street.
No.
You're not going to go wrong with Clover.
Yeah.
No one's going to say, Sand Cove. What did a Sand Cove ever do to deserve a street name? I hate Sand Coves. But every time you do a person's name, that is a risk. And we have some that are questionable, have a questionable background.
And we could do many, many podcast episodes on this topic. Unfortunately, we could. And of course, what's interesting about some of these characters too is that they were controversial at the time. It's not like we're necessarily applying our modern standards. I mean, there were people criticizing them at the time.
I have some questions for you as a historian on that, but let's get into it with Germain Street. Besides my spell checker, I'm always trying to get either German or Germain as germane to the issue. Yeah. Let's talk about how did Germain get its name?
Yeah. Do you want to just give some impressions of Germain? Because you've done your book on the St. John fire, and that's one of the signature streets that's rebuilt after that fire.
It's a signature street and always was. So it would have been the heart of St. John as far as residential, churches, theaters, hotels, businesses. So this was the street before the fire. And it came back thriving after the fire. It was one of the first ones to be rebuilt, and it became the commercial street. So certainly it's a beautiful street.
It is. And I always, if a tourist asks, what else can I do? Where can I go? In St. John, I say, well, why don't you take a stroll down Germain and some of the streets nearby? Because I think you'll find it very interesting and calming almost to walk.
Absolutely. But let's go to the dark history of Germain. The name of the street, not the street itself, is beautiful. The name.
Yeah, certainly controversial guy, George Germain, first Viscount Sackville. He was the Secretary of State for the Colonies for George III during the American War of Independence. So it means he's a leading cabinet minister. Of course, George III was quite a bit of a hardliner on the war, and Germain was known as
madness too.
Yeah, that part
too. Some madness. Probably didn't help things.
But Germain was regarded as a hardliner vis-a-vis the rebellious colonies, because there was a faction of that government that wanted to be more conciliatory, and some of the military and naval leaders as well. So he had, there's a controversy surrounding the American Revolution. But why don't you talk about his controversial early career, Mark?
Well, he was involved with the uprising, Jacobite rising in Scotland that was suppressed brutally suppressed. So he was involved with that. So that started showing.
Yeah. He was involved with the British Army suppressing, the Scottish Highlanders who took up arms against the British government. Yeah.
No evidence that he was directly involved with this, just involved with the British Army. But we have atrocities against civilians, including torture and killing and sexual assaults and basically a campaign of terror.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a pretty dark side of British history for sure. And so prior that was 1746. Prior to that, he had fought with distinction in the British Army in Belgium against the forces of Louis XV, and then he goes back to fighting in the 7 Years' War in Europe,
or not fighting.
Oh, right. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
That's the thing we have to talk about. His choice that actually got him court-martialed.
Yeah.
And given the boot forever from the British Army, which is like a major sanction.
Yeah.
And that was he disobeyed the orders. This would have been in the Battle of Minden in Germany. And he was ordered to go in and clean up. Like basically the British had won. All he had to do is go in and clean up and claim victory for his commander. And he refused those orders. Yeah. And although the British won that battle, that refusal got him court-martialed for disobeying orders. Now, it was touted that Germain was a coward. And that's why he didn't want to go in, going, oh, we already won this thing. I could go in and get myself killed. Like, why would I do that? But it seemed to be more of spite. Not wanting his commanding officer to take the glory, because the person who goes in last, cleans up, claims the victory.
Yeah, and I think the complicating factor is that the overall commander here was German and an ally, right? But certainly his early career wouldn't show that he was a coward. He fought with distinction, in the war in 1745. So
I'm getting spite. Yeah, I'm getting spite. I really am looking at it as a motivation.
You think he's down for the count, and then.
Well, you have to be. Come on. He was court-martialed to the point he got kicked out of the British Army forever. He's not coming back, right, Greg?
Wrong. His career is rehabilitated. Not only does he come back into the army or polite circles, he becomes a key minister for George III during the time of the American Revolution.
Oh, okay. And
that's not a very important time.
No, not at all. This is the guy we want, the guy that's motivated by spite. So what happened with Germain, with his role in the American Revolution?
Well, hardliner, no negotiations, total war. Particularly, I think once the had that Saratoga campaign where the British Army failed to make the invasion in from Canada into New York colony, and then France came in on the side of the American patriots, but then Germain and the hardliners are even more hardline. Okay, this is war to the end now, right? And aggressive British commanders adopted more aggressive tactics, and Germain thought that was great.
It wasn't great, though, was it?
No, I mean
it wasn't great. It was being tone deaf to the American situation. It actually inspired the Americans to fight harder, where a lighter touch, at least historians looking back are saying a lighter touch would have made the difference. And there was a lot of advocates at the time going, this is not the right approach.
Yeah, even the Earl of Shelburne, who later would reform government in 1783, right? This was like the pro-peace faction, would agree to a peace treaty. He denounced the aggressive approach that Germain supported as immoral and bad for Britain's reputation as a civilized nation.
Yeah, that's pretty condemning words. Like, this is, again, the background of Germain Street, the namesake of Germain Street.
And then after the Battle of Yorktown, 1781, right, Germain is saying we should keep fighting.
Yeah, he was like the only voice saying we should keep fighting. Germain, dude, it's over.
There was one other guy, Benedict Arnold.
Okay, okay. Story. Yeah, there we go. So those guys want to keep everyone else. Yeah. Come on, it's over.
Yeah.
It's over. But and we had like the 1778 attack on Cherry Hill in central Cherry Valley in central New York.
Yeah.
Roughly 30 civilians were killed, including women and children in that. And of course, Germain denounced that.
No,
No?
he said it was a success.
the killing of 30 civilians, including women and children, as success. Okay, so this is the guy. Let's bring this all together into a package, shall we? So you have him in the Jacobite revolution, and not necessarily pinned directly to it, but in part of the British army that committed all these atrocities. Then you have him insubordinate and refusing command in the Battle of Minden, and getting court-martialed, booted out of the British Army forever. Then he comes back in to the American Revolution, and many believe that he had a big part of the British failing in the American Revolution. And then we go ahead and we name a street after him.
That's right.
I'll have to ask you this, okay? Because we talked about, you know what? People knew about this. So it wasn't like this was dug up 100 years after people knew about this. But would there have been some spin doctoring at the time?
I think
might that have happened? Going, that didn't really happen that bad because, like, that sounds really bad for us.
Or political partisanship, all that, the usual stuff. And the average person probably didn't know these details, right? The average, it'd be the elite educated classes. And of course, they would be split between supporters of one party and then supporters of the other party, right?
So you could easily be spinning it to the masses. And because, like, Germain, it's not just Germain Street. We're talking Sackville, New Brunswick, named after him. We're talking Lower Sackville, Middle Sackville, Nova Scotia, named after
Sackville Street, Halifax, maybe.
Like, there's a lot of streets named after this guy. And we got to move on. And we're moving on to another dark spot that is reflected in the streets of St. John, and that's slavery, the institution of slavery.
Which we'll cover in a separate podcast, no doubt. But we just want to mention that the city had wards as well. So on the west side, we had Brooks Ward and then Watson Street, and they were both named after Brooke Watson, English-born loyalist, an entrepreneur. He acted he was a kind of a major guy in helping to get loyalist shipping to get out of New York in 1783, right? And later acted as New Brunswick's agent in London, kind of a troubleshooter for the new colony of New Brunswick. And in 1789, he made a speech. He later became a British member of Parliament, and he gave a speech in Parliament in defense of slavery. Do you have the?
I do have it, and just to give you an annotated version of it, but here's the words. The fact was, this is the quote, the fact was that the natives of Africa were taken from a worse state of slavery in their own country to one more mild. He recommended it to the committee to soften the rigors of slavery by wholesome regulations, but not to adopt so rash a conduct as to vote the immediate abolition of the trade. So basically saying, you know what, this is better. Like, how many times have you heard that argument when people are mistreated? Well, they're being mistreated better than they were, like it was worse mistreatment. That's not the bar. Better is not the bar. Equality is the bar.
And there's still people saying that about residential schools in Canada, right?
I've heard this so many times about mistreatment. And it's just like, that is not the bar. But this is what Brooke Watson was saying. And just a little bit of context, there were enslaved people in St. John. Early St. John.
We will talk about that in another episode, I'm sure.
Because slavery the institution of slavery in the British Empire was legal until 1833.
And the slave trade, meaning transatlantic slave trade, was only outlawed about 1807, 09 or 08 between British colonies, but you could still trade from New Brunswick to Nova Scotia or from the West Indies to Nova Scotia even after 1809, right? So then we have, this is Sheffield. A bit later because it's 1805. It's a kind of a generation after, but John Baker Holroyd, the first Earl, he's the first one, first Earl of Sheffield. He was an English member of Parliament, an aristocrat with lands in Ireland, seeing the pattern here.
Yes.
And he was educated, author of several books, expert on political economy, which is the old-fashioned term for like economics and trade and tariffs and things like that. And in 1790, he published, I think you can find it online, Observations on the Project for Abolishing the Slave Trade, and he opposed abolition. of slavery.
Well, again, let's name a street after him, but he kind of got comeuppance in a way for that because Sheffield Street was not known as being the nicest area in town. Kind of had a shady reputation, and eventually it disappeared.
It was renamed, but like what happened, and maybe we'll talk about this because maybe someday we'll talk about the British military in St. John, but when the British soldiers were moved from Fort Howe to that part of the South End, things went downhill because soldiers are great in times of war, but when they're off duty, they can get into all sorts of trouble, right? Yeah. So, but he was, it was a big deal in 1805. The city fathers renamed what was then called South Street, Sheffield Street, in his honor, and they gave him the key to the city. And I think there was a portrait commissioned of Lord Sheffield. So he was flavor of the week.
Flavor of the
St.
week.
John in 1805, right? So.
And he had his 15 minutes as a street name.
Yeah.
Okay, let's head over to the north end and let's head to Elgin Street.
Yeah, and just to remind people, that used to be Portland, not to be confused with Portland, Maine, but it joined St. John in 1889, and everyone refers to it as the North End, now and forever maybe. So Elgin Street was named after another British sort of aristocrat, James Bruce, Lord Elgin, who, if you remember your high school history, maybe he was Governor General of Canada in the late 1840s, and he helped initiate responsible government in Canada in 1848. And that's kind of an important moment in our constitutional history. He was the man on the scene when that happened.
Sounding great. So far, you've won me over. He deserves a street name.
Okay, but things get a little messy, Mark. So if he continues as a British diplomat and official, of course, Britain's expanding its imperial holdings. And, the thing about imperialism is it's often with force, right? Or the threat of force. We're going to invade you. We're going to come in and attack your cities, that type of thing. So after his stint in Canada, he was a key diplomat in opening up China to British trade. Of course, we're getting into the whole opium issue, right? Where the British are forcing the government of India to take opium imports from government of China, to take opium exports from British India so the East India Company and the British government can make money, right? It's still a very problematic issue in China, the memory of what the British did. So we're talking about the Opium Wars. So he was on the scene in the late 1850s when new tensions rose between the French, the British, I think the Americans on one side, and the Chinese government on the other, and that led to the Second Opium War. And can you tell us what happened there?
Well, of course, he went in very respectful to the culture of the area, and certainly didn't disrespect the culture of the Chinese people or China. He did. No, he totally did. So he ended up getting on the scene, and Elgin, personally, I believe, ordered the destruction of the Summer Palace and the old Summer Palace, which was basically the Versailles of the China's emperors, in Beijing.
Now, to be fair, there had been an ugly incident where some hostages or envoys had been sent to the Chinese, and some of them were killed and tortured and mistreated. So the British troops went in, and the French troops as well, and they were ordered to basically loot the place. And I guess the French soldiers decided not to do it. Right? We're not doing this. Yeah. But the British soldiers followed the orders, and they looted both complexes of priceless cultural artifacts. It was hard work. It took 4,000 soldiers 3 days to destroy the palaces.
It's not easy to loot and pillage.
Yeah, and that Queen Victoria loved small pets. So what's the connection between this attack on the palace in Beijing and the looting and Queen Victoria?
Well, I'm glad you asked, Greg, because the invaders happened to steal 5 of the emperor's pet Pekingese dogs.
Yes.
One which was given to Queen Victoria.
Yeah.
Stolen dogs, artifacts, and with the stolen artifacts, these artifacts ended up all over the world. In museums, and I believe there's still efforts to reclaim these. Yeah.
And again, China still regards the destruction of these palaces as barbaric acts of cultural vandalism. And the ruins of the complex, which have not been rebuilt, are used to kind of remind Chinese people and visitors of what they call the century of humiliation of China by the Western powers in Japan. So again, he's the man on the spot responsible for a lot of that destruction.
And we're still feeling that today. Tensions between China and the West. And we got a guy that had a lot to do with at least something that's pointed toward the cause of that century of humiliation and that cultural vandalism. And we named a street in St. John after him.
Yeah.
Let's go to West Side.
West Side.
Back to the West Side.
Yeah.
One final trip to the West Side.
Let's cross the bridge, or one of the bridges. So let's talk about another late 18th century problematic figure.
Would that happen to be Admiral George Rodney by chance?
Yes, and I knew nothing about this till quite recently, and I grew up on the West Side. So we'll kind of give it a dramatic spin here. He was a greedy, anti-Semitic Royal Navy admiral who possibly contributed to the final American victory in the War of Independence. There's a mouthful.
There's a mouthful. Okay.
Yeah.
He started off good enough, I guess. Like, he was certainly had an entrepreneurial spirit at the age of 14. He joined the Royal Navy and captain by the age of 24. But it started to be the question in his character came with what he did with that role, and he used it to accumulate wealth.
Yeah, and that was fair. That was part of the game. First of all, often you had to buy the Navy was a little bit different, but often you had to buy your commission. But a lot of these 18th century guys are always in debt, right? So, and you're allowed to take prize money by capturing enemy ships and cargoes and things like that. But some of his critics began to think the main reason he was fighting was to get the prize money and not to fulfill British strategic interest, right?
Well, he needed some money because he had a bit of a penchant for gambling.
Yeah, gambling. And also he became a member of parliament at one point, and that was costly. You basically had to bribe people and pay for elections and buy a lot of rum and beer and guys with clubs to work at your, so I mean, it's all kind of packed together, right?
So that ethical behavior, yes.
Yeah.
It's very expensive.
Yeah. So he captured important French sugar colonies, including Martinique. And during the American Revolution, he ended on a strong finish, as we'll say. But prior to that, is pretty controversial. He went into a little island called St. Eustatius, which was a small island on a base for supplying the American patriots at the time. So there was kind of a strategic reason for going there. But when they got there, the British squadron found 150 trading vessels stocked full of supplies, warehouses brimming with supplies, and all of this could be confiscated for His Majesty, but I get my cut.
And Rodney must have been just drooling when he discovered that.
So it was allowed by the laws of war to claim this as prize money, but for what he did next was not really kosher. Kosher is a bad example here because they're talking about Jewish merchants. Mm-hmm. It wasn't really seen as civilized behavior. He summarily ordered the immediate expulsion of the island's adult male Jewish population. They were roughed up by sailors and robbed of their personal jewelry and property, and they weren't even allowed to go home and see their wives and children before they had to get on ships and leave the island immediately. So that was very controversial. It was his treatment of the Jewish merchants, some of whom were British subjects, was actually denounced in the House of Commons back in London, right? And then when the French later went to reoccupy St. Eustatius during the war, they found that most of it had been burnt to the ground by Rodney.
Wow. Oh, yeah. Okay. Can we back up a little bit? Do we know the reason for the anti-Semitic actions of Rodney?
Well, it's interesting. There was anti-Semitism. There still is, unfortunately. But, there's certainly anti-Semitism in England and other European countries at the time. But it's the Jewish merchants were not the only merchants on the island. But a number of because it's not a very big place, right?
Yeah,
but some of the leading merchants were Jews, and he pointed out to the Jews, right? So again, I haven't read into the details there, but it was just we have to attribute it to anti-Semitism because it wasn't all the merchants; it was the Jewish merchants.
Wow. Okay, and again, Rodney Street, St. John. Yeah, named after him.
Yeah, and a little footnote: his naval, we don't have the time, but his naval maneuverings or lack thereof, according to some historians, allowed a French squadron to sail past him go to the coast of the United States, and that squadron later blocked in the British at Yorktown. General Cornwallis was surrounded by George Washington, and that led to that final battle, which was the final defeat of the British. And 2 years later, the war's over. So some historians have blamed Rodney for contributing to this defeat.
And then he had a bit of a redemption period, I believe.
Yeah.
Or redemption action.
Yeah, the following spring, he did intercept an enemy fleet and saved it from invading Jamaica, which was so he kind of ended on a positive note, and he came back, and the public, he was suddenly popular for the public. But up to then, the British had basically recalled him. They were ready to throw the book at him, right? And then he did have this last victory.
Thing.
Yeah.
and got a street named after him.
Yeah.
Okay, well, as I'm sure it's clear, today's topic is connected to a much larger conversation that we've been having in the world, and it's about the pros and cons of renaming streets and parks and public buildings and towns and cities. Any thoughts about that, Greg?
Well, I think it's a bit new and it's a bit different in terms of the scale and intensity, but renaming is not a new thing in terms of like taking down statues and things like that. So, yes, we can say it's modern movements like Black Lives Matter and in Canada, Truth and Reconciliation, maybe giving it a bit more energy. But if you look at, say, Ireland, the famous O'Connell Street, which you'll walk on if you go to downtown Dublin, one of my favorite places, that used to be called Sackville Street. There's Sackville again, right?
Yeah.
It was renamed after Daniel O'Connell, the Irish nationalist, way back in 1924. And then in Montreal, Dorchester Boulevard, which was named after a British governor of Lower Canada, was called Dorchester until the late 1980s, when it was renamed after René Lévesque Boulevard, after the famous PQ, Parti Québécois leader and premier. And we have examples as well in Vancouver and other cities, and cities all around many places around the world. Cities are looking at some of their names and looking as to whether they should rename them, right? And so it's not a new thing, but it's gaining in some intensity.
Yeah, and a number of street names in St. John, as we had said, have been changed, and more will be changed over the years. And I'll put you on the spot, Greg. Yep. What would be your top three for street names, people who are deserving of having street names after them in St. John?
You mentioned Cornelius Sparrow. I think he'd be a contender. Is it Ella Hathaway, Frank Hathaway's spouse? She was a leading advocate for women's rights, right? And social reform, right? And again, if we wanted to have, we do have a Sam Davis Drive, like he was the first Jewish mayor, right? So I'm trying to think of some other, again, I don't want to play my Irish card because, my grandfather was from Ireland, but it might be nice to have one other street named after someplace in Ireland.
Yes, definitely.
And maybe
I'd
Indigenous. Indigenous as well, whether, again, I think it would be presumptuous for non-Indigenous people to say, hey, we're going to come up with this name. Maybe if there was permission and liaison and consultation with Indigenous groups, there's a place for an Indigenous name.
No, there definitely is. And my list would include Elias Harding. I believe he's deserving. We talked about him in our 1785 election riot podcast. Yep. We'll see Wayne. Now, there is a Wayne Street I found in the West St. John. I have no idea if that's any chance. It seems like a newer neighborhood, but Elsie Wayne would be up on my list. This is what I would like to see because I'm a big fan, and he's now become part of the St. John community. Yeah. Maestro Fresh West. And if I were to choose a street name out of my past, because whenever I think Maestro Fresh West, I think Prince William Street, because I would be blasting that out of my car, let your backbone slide as I'm leaving St. John High School in 1991.
Right.
So, but Rossay Avenue renamed Maestro Fresh West. Would it be Maestro Ave? Well, how would you use that? Would they like come on, Rossay is known as its own thing. We can rename that street.
Yeah. Interesting, Mark. You're thinking outside of the box, big time here.
There we go. And we can't forget about the British origins of naming streets in St. John. So we should be focusing on a smaller but very important British immigration that occurred in the early 2000s. We need a James Mollinger Way. And I think the perfect street would be the one running in front of TD Station. Okay, anything else?
No, I just say that personally, I found this topic way more interesting once I got into it than when I first thought of, what about the streets?
There we go. So that is all for this episode of St. John, Nothing Happened Here. So please join us again for the next episode. And hey, come visit us and leave us a message at our home on the web, www.nothinghappenedhere.ca.
Thank you for listening to St. John, Nothing Happened Here. To learn more, join us at www.nothinghappenedhere.ca or connect with us on Facebook. Other means of communication include, but are not limited to, telegrams, smoke signals, and carrier pigeons. However you want to reach us, we want to hear from you.